The morning sun poured through the glass walls of the airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Travelers rushed from one gate to another, some dragging heavy suitcases, others holding coffee cups and boarding passes tightly in their hands. The usual hum of announcements played overhead, blending with the chatter of people speaking a dozen different languages. In the middle of this chaos stood an elderly man, calm and still like a rock in a fast-moving river. He was dressed in a simple gray suit that had seen better days, his silver hair neatly combed back and his face lined with years of experience and quiet strength. His name was not widely known, but to those who understood power, his presence alone could change the course of a business or even an entire industry. He had arrived early for his flight, just as he always did. There was no need to rush. His life had taught him patience. He walked slowly, using a cane carved from dark wood, each step deliberate and measured. His eyes, sharp despite his age, scanned the crowd without judgment. He was not the kind of man to demand attention, but somehow, people noticed him anyway. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or perhaps the quiet confidence that came from knowing his own worth. Whatever the reason, those who passed by felt a strange urge to look twice, though most dismissed the feeling and moved on. As he reached the boarding gate, he handed his ticket to the attendant with a polite nod. She smiled briefly and checked his documents before passing them back. Everything seemed in order. The plane was ready, the passengers were boarding, and there was no sign of any problem. But then, out of nowhere, a security officer approached him. The man was young, tall, and built like someone who spent more time in the gym than reading reports. His uniform was crisp, his badge shining under the fluorescent lights. He looked at the elderly man with a mix of suspicion and authority, as if expecting him to react nervously. Without a word, the officer motioned for backup. Another guard stepped forward, and together they surrounded the older man. Confused murmurs spread among the nearby passengers. Some watched with concern, others with curiosity. The elderly man remained silent, his expression unreadable. He did not raise his voice, nor did he try to argue. Instead, he simply waited, as if he had seen this kind of thing before. Then, without explanation, the officer informed him that he would not be allowed to board. For safety reasons, the man said, as if those 3 words could justify anything. The elderly man raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He glanced at the other passengers, many of whom now stared openly. A woman near the front gasped, while a businessman shook his head in disbelief. No one stepped forward to defend the old man, and he didn't seem to expect anyone to. He was escorted away from the gate, his belongings taken aside for inspection. Again, everything came up clean. There was no reason for the ejection other than the assumption made by the officer. Still, the decision stood. The elderly man was told he would have to leave the terminal and rebook another flight. As he turned to walk away, he paused for a moment and looked back at the plane. It was just a glance, but something about it sent a chill down the spine of the nearest flight attendant. Once outside the secure area, the elderly man found a quiet bench and sat down. He placed his cane beside him and pulled a small, outdated phone from his coat pocket. It wasn't the kind of device most people use these days. It lacked touch screens and apps, but it worked, and that was all he needed. With slow, practiced movements, he dialed a number from memory. The call connected almost instantly. On the other end of the line, a voice answered with a tone of respect. The elderly man spoke only a few sentences, but the effect was immediate. The person on the other side grew silent, then began issuing rapid instructions. Within minutes, phones started ringing in offices across the country. Executives were pulled from meetings, lawyers were called in, and financial analysts scrambled to understand what was happening. Word traveled fast in certain circles, and soon, the name of the man who had been removed from the plane became the most talked about topic in high-level boardrooms. Back at the airport, the security officer who had ejected the man remained unaware of the storm he had set in motion. He continued his rounds, confident in the belief that he had done his job correctly. Meanwhile, the airline's customer service team received a sudden flood of complaints about the incident. Passengers who had witnessed the event began posting on social media, sharing videos and calling for answers. News outlets picked up the story, and within hours, the airline was facing a public relations nightmare. But the real consequences were yet to come. The elderly man's phone call had triggered a chain reaction far beyond the reach of public opinion. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would shake the foundation of the company. Investments were being reviewed, contracts canceled, and partnerships reconsidered. The man had not shouted or threatened. He had simply made a call. And in the world he operated in, that was more than enough. As the day wore on, the airline's leadership began to realize the gravity of their mistake. They searched for information, trying to understand who the man was and why such powerful figures were suddenly involved. What they discovered chilled them to the core. The elderly man was not just another passenger. He was a key player in the global financial network that kept airlines afloat. His influence stretched across continents, touching banks, governments, and investment firms. He was the kind of man whose name rarely appeared in headlines but whose decisions shaped industries. And now, he had decided that the airline had crossed a line. By evening, the first signs of financial trouble began to show. Stock prices dipped slightly, followed by larger drops as the news spread. Investors who had once trusted the company now questioned its judgment. Legal teams were put on standby, and crisis management experts were brought in. The CEO himself ordered an internal investigation, desperate to contain the damage, but it was already too late. The elderly man had made his point, and soon the airline would learn just how expensive that single act of arrogance had been. The airline's headquarters was in chaos. Phones rang nonstop, emails flooded inboxes, and executives rushed between meetings with grim expressions on their faces. What had started as a simple security incident at the airport had turned into something far bigger, something they didn't fully understand yet but knew they couldn't ignore. The man who had been removed from the plane was no ordinary traveler. He was a silent force in global finance, a name whispered behind closed doors in boardrooms across the world. And now, he had made his presence known. Inside one of the top meeting rooms, the CEO sat stiffly at the head of a long wooden table, surrounded by legal advisors, public relations experts, and financial analysts. A large screen displayed real-time stock data, and the numbers were not in their favor. The company's value was dropping fast. Investors were pulling out, partners were asking questions, and media outlets were circling like vultures. The CEO ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. How could one man cause so much damage so quickly? Outside the building, the situation was just as tense. News of the elderly man's removal had gone viral. Travelers who had witnessed the event posted videos online, showing the calm dignity with which he had accepted the decision. Commentators debated whether the airline had overstepped its authority, while others speculated about the man's identity. Who was he? Why did his phone call have such an immediate effect? The mystery only fueled public interest, turning what might have been a minor incident into a full-blown scandal. Back inside the office, a senior financial advisor finally broke the silence. "We need to find out exactly who this man is," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "And we need to do it fast." Within minutes, researchers were digging through records, searching for any mention of the man's name or connections to the airline. What they found stunned them. The elderly man was not just a passenger. He was a major shareholder in several investment firms that held significant stakes in the airline. His influence reached beyond aviation. It touched banking, insurance, and even government contracts. 1. Reports showed that a foundation linked to him controlled billions in assets, many of which were tied directly to the airline's operations. Another document revealed that he had quietly funded key expansion projects years ago, helping the company grow into the global brand it was today. He had never sought credit or public recognition, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Now, with Phi's one quiet phone call, he had set everything in motion. The CEO felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about bad publicity anymore. This was about survival. If the man decided to pull his support completely, the airline could face serious financial consequences. Loans might be recalled, partnerships canceled, and funding withdrawn. It wouldn't take much for the company to spiral into crisis. Meanwhile, the elderly man remained calm. He had checked into a modest hotel suite after leaving the airport, choosing comfort over luxury. He sat by the window watching the city lights flicker below, his cane resting beside him. He didn't seem angry, just disappointed. To him, the incident was more than just a mistake. It was a sign of how easily people in power could forget respect and humility. He had built his career on trust and discretion, and he expected the same from others. That trust had been broken. He picked up his old-style phone again and dialed another number. This time he spoke longer, giving clear instructions. The person on the other end listened carefully, nodding even though the elderly man couldn't see them. When the call ended, the line went dead, but the wheels were already turning. Within hours, banks began freezing lines of credit connected to the airline. Investment firms reconsidered pending deals. Insurance companies reviewed policies with new scrutiny. Every financial tie that had once supported the airline suddenly came under pressure. The message was clear. The elderly man was no longer willing to stand behind the company without answers. At the airline's headquarters, panic grew. The CEO ordered an emergency press conference, hoping to contain the fallout. Reporters gathered. Outside the building, cameras rolling, microphones ready. Inside, the PR team worked furiously to craft a statement that would show accountability without admitting fault. But the CEO knew the truth. Words alone wouldn't fix this. As he stepped onto the stage, flashes of light blinded him for a moment. Questions came rapidly, overlapping voices demanding explanations. He raised a hand for silence and took a deep breath before speaking. Earlier today, a passenger was denied boarding due to a misunderstanding by our security personnel. We deeply regret this incident and are conducting a full investigation. His words sounded rehearsed and the reporters weren't satisfied. One shouted, "Who is this man?" Another asked, "Is this why your stock is crashing?" The CEO tried to maintain composure, but sweat formed on his forehead. He answered carefully, avoiding direct details, but it was obvious he didn't have control of the situation. Behind the scenes, the airline scrambled to reach out to the elderly man. Calls were made to his personal number, but they went unanswered. Messages were sent through intermediaries begging for a chance to apologize and make things right. But the man remained silent, allowing the pressure to build. He wasn't interested. In empty apologies, he wanted action. By the next morning, the first major financial blow landed. A major investment firm announced that it was withdrawing its support from the airline, citing concerns over leadership decisions. Then another followed, and another. Within a few hours, the airline had lost nearly $4 billion in backing. News spread like wildfire, and the company's stock plummeted further. Inside the headquarters, employees watched the numbers fall with growing dread. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if layoffs were coming. Others stared at their screens, in disbelief. Unable to process the speed at which everything was collapsing, the CEO locked himself in his office, refusing to speak to anyone except his most trusted advisors. But there was nothing they could do. The elderly man had made his move, and the airline was now paying the price. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened lawsuits or demanded headlines. He had simply pulled back his support, and that was enough to send shockwaves through the entire industry. As the sun rose over the city, the elderly man packed his small suitcase. He had no intention of staying any longer. He had made his point, and now it was time to move on. He left the hotel without saying goodbye, disappearing into the early morning crowd like a ghost. The airline, meanwhile, stood on the edge of uncertainty. Its leaders knew they had made a grave error, but it was too late to undo the damage. The man had shown them the cost of arrogance, and the lesson would not be forgotten. In the days that followed, the story continued to unfold. New reports surfaced about the elderly man's background, revealing his role in shaping the modern aviation industry. Some called him a legend, others a warning. But one thing was certain: no one would ever underestimate him again. The fallout from the airline's actions spread like wildfire. Within hours of the stock market opening, panic gripped investors who had once placed their trust in the company. The airline's shares plummeted even further as rumors swirled about the true identity of the elderly man and the scale of his influence. Analysts scrambled to understand what was happening, while financial experts warned that this wasn't just a public relations crisis, it was a full-scale financial reckoning. Inside the airline's headquarters, tension reached a breaking point. The CEO, usually composed and confident, now looked tired and overwhelmed. His once polished suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, as if he had forgotten it was there. He sat at his desk, staring at the reports coming in from every direction. Banks were tightening credit lines, partners were threatening to pull out, and government regulators had begun asking questions. Every decision made in the past 24 hours felt like a mistake magnified tenfold. Across town, news outlets broadcast non-stop coverage of the unfolding drama. Television anchors read updates with growing urgency. "We are following a shocking development involving one of the world's largest airlines," one reporter said, holding up a photo of the elderly man taken during the airport incident. "Sources now confirm that this man is not just another passenger. He is a major financial player whose decisions have sent shockwaves through the industry." Social media exploded with reactions. Travelers expressed outrage over how quickly an innocent man had been treated with suspicion and disrespect. Others debated whether security personnel had gone too far, using vague safety concerns to justify what looked like an unjust removal. Memes began circulating online, showing the elderly man with captions like, "One call, $4 billion gone. Respect your elders." The story had become more than just a business scandal. It was now a symbol of power, justice, and the consequences of arrogance. Back at the hotel where the elderly man had spent the night, the staff remained unaware of the storm brewing outside. He had checked out early, leaving behind only a small tip and a polite thank you note for the housekeeping team. He moved through the city streets unnoticed, blending into the morning rush like any other traveler. Only those who knew his name understood the weight of his silence. Meanwhile, inside the airline's crisis command center, a room filled with blinking screens, whiteboards cluttered with notes, and exhausted executives, the leadership team attempted to strategize their next move. Lawyers advised against public apologies without careful wording, fearing legal repercussions. Public relations experts suggested issuing a statement acknowledging fault, but stopping short of admitting liability. Financial analysts urged the CEO to reach out directly to the man responsible for the chaos, hoping that a personal appeal might still save what remained of the company's stability. But no one knew exactly how to contact him. Efforts to track down the elderly man proved difficult. His phone calls went unanswered, and intermediaries who had worked with him in the past refused to speak on record. Some claimed they hadn't heard from him in years. Others hinted that he preferred to operate in secrecy, making decisions behind closed doors rather than in the spotlight. One former associate, speaking anonymously, described him as a man who never raises his voice because he doesn't need to. People listen when he speaks. As pressure mounted, the airline's leadership decided to take drastic action. A fleet of high-ranking executives boarded private jets bound for different cities where the elderly man was rumored to be staying. They carried apology letters, offers of compensation, and desperate pleas for reconsideration, but none of them would reach him in time. Back on Wall Street, the damage continued to spread. Hedge funds that had once held the airline's stock quietly sold off their shares, accelerating the decline. Credit rating agencies issued warnings about the company's financial health, citing instability in leadership and governance. Suppliers who had relied on steady contracts with the airline began calling in payments early, unsure if the company would survive long enough to honor its obligations. At airports across the country, passengers noticed the changes immediately. Flight delays increased due to logistical issues caused by financial constraints. Customer service desks became overwhelmed with complaints from travelers affected by last-minute cancellations. Employees whispered among themselves about layoffs, fear creeping into conversations that had once been about promotions and growth. And still, the elderly man remained silent. He had no interest in watching the company crumble in real time. He had already made his decision, and he did not believe in second-guessing himself. Years of experience had taught him that people in positions of authority often failed to recognize their own mistakes until it was too late. He had given the airline a chance to correct its course, but they had ignored the warning signs. Now they were paying the price. In a quiet office miles away from the chaos, a longtime business associate of the elderly man reviewed the latest reports. He had known the man for decades, having worked alongside him on some of the most ambitious aviation ventures in history. He watched the events unfold with a mix of admiration and concern. Admiration, because he knew exactly how calculated the man's actions had been. Concern, because he also understood that this was not just about revenge or spite. It was about sending a message. "This isn't just about one flight," the associate muttered, flipping through a document detailing the airline's recent losses. "This is about respect, about accountability, and about proving that even the biggest companies can fall if they forget who really holds the power." Outside, the city continued to move forward, unaware of the invisible battle being fought behind the scenes. Trains ran on schedule, cars filled the streets, and newspapers printed new headlines every hour. The world kept turning, as it always did, but for one airline everything had changed in less than 48 hours. By evening, the CEO gathered his senior team one last time. His voice was quieter now, lacking the confidence he once wore like armor. "We need to face facts," he said, looking each person in the eye. "We've lost control of this situation. We acted carelessly, and now we're dealing with the consequences." No one argued. No one tried to shift blame. They all knew the truth. And deep down, they all wished they had listened before it came to this. The elderly man, meanwhile, had already moved on. He was seated comfortably aboard a private jet, sipping tea as the aircraft lifted off into the sky. Below, the city lights twinkled like stars reflected on Earth. He gazed out the window, watching the world shrink beneath him. He had done what needed to be done. Now it was time to let the lessons settle in. Because power, real power, didn't come from loud voices or flashy headlines. It came from knowing when to act and when to walk away. The airline's fall from grace was swift and brutal. What had once been a symbol of global travel and efficiency was now the center of a financial storm that no amount of damage control could contain. The company's leadership, once confident in their dominance over the skies, now sat in silence as reports continued to pour in detailing the extent of their losses. Billions had vanished overnight. Partnerships were dissolving like mist, and the trust of both passengers and investors was crumbling faster than they could respond. Inside the headquarters, tension had reached a breaking point. Executives who had once argued over marketing strategies and expansion plans now found themselves locked in urgent discussions about survival. Some whispered about filing for bankruptcy protection, while others insisted on finding a buyer before the situation became irreversible. The CEO, once seen as a visionary leader, now looked more like a man trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had spent years building his career, climbing the ranks with careful decisions and calculated risks. But one moment of poor judgment had undone nearly everything. Outside the office walls, the public reaction was just as fierce. Passengers who had once flown with loyalty now shared stories of bad service, delayed flights, and unreturned complaints. Online forums filled with anger and disappointment, not just toward the security team, but toward the entire company. Travel bloggers wrote scathing reviews. Influencers called for boycotts, and news anchors debated whether this incident would mark the end of an era for the airline. What had started as a single act of disrespect had turned into a full-scale reckoning. At the airport where it all began, the mood had shifted dramatically. Security officers moved through their routines with visible unease, aware that every action they took was now under scrutiny. The officer who had removed the elderly man from the plane avoided eye contact with his coworkers, his confidence replaced by a quiet fear of what might come next. Rumors spread that he might be suspended or even fired, though no official statement had been made. The airline's legal team was already preparing for potential lawsuits, knowing that the world was watching every move they made. Meanwhile, the elderly man remained calm and composed. He had landed at a private airfield hours earlier, stepping off the jet without fanfare or attention. His journey had taken him to a quiet coastal town far from the noise of major cities, where the only sounds were the waves crashing against the shore and the distant cry of seagulls. Here he could reflect without interruption, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before him. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He had built his life around principles of respect, humility, and discretion. He believed in quiet strength and making decisions that carried weight without needing to shout them from rooftops. And yet, time and again, he saw how easily those values were forgotten in the pursuit of power and control. The airline's actions were not just a personal slight. They were a reflection of a broader problem in the business world, a lack of accountability, a failure to recognize the people behind the titles. As he walked along the beach, his cane tapping lightly against the sand, he thought about the lessons that needed to be learned. He knew that money alone wouldn't teach them. It never did. True change came from understanding, from acknowledging mistakes and taking responsibility. He had used his influence to make a point, but now it was up to the airline to decide how they would move forward. Back in the city, the airline's leadership struggled to find a path out of the crisis. They had issued formal apologies, launched internal investigations, and promised to retrain their security personnel, but none of it seemed to matter. Investors continued to pull out, partners distanced themselves, and the media showed no signs of losing interest. It was clear that words alone wouldn't be enough to restore trust. A meeting was called, one of many in recent days, but this one felt different. The CEO sat at the head of the table, surrounded by advisors, lawyers, and financial experts. This time there was no posturing, no attempts to shift blame. Everyone in the room understood the gravity of the situation. "We need to do something drastic," one advisor finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "Something that proves we're serious about changing." Another nodded. "We can start with transparency. We release detailed reports, show exactly what happened, and take full responsibility." "But will that be enough?" someone else asked. "People don't just want explanations, they want justice." The CEO leaned forward, rubbing his temples. He had spent his entire career believing in strong leadership, decisive action, and strategic thinking. But now he realized that leadership wasn't just about making tough calls, it was about listening, learning, and sometimes admitting when you were wrong. "We need to reach out to him directly," he said finally. "Not with apologies, not with excuses. We need to sit down with him face to face and hear what he has to say." There was a pause as the weight of his words settled over the room. It was a bold move, and there was no guarantee the elderly man would even agree to meet. But if there was any chance of salvaging what remained of the company, it was worth trying. Across town, a message was sent through carefully chosen intermediaries. It was short and respectful. "We understand our mistake. We are willing to listen." Whether the elderly man would accept the offer remained to be seen, but for the first time in days, the airline's leadership felt a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, the world continued to watch. Social media buzzed with speculation about what would happen next. Would the airline survive? Would the elderly man ever speak publicly about the incident? Or would he simply disappear again, leaving behind only the consequences of his silent power? As night fell over the city, the elderly man stood on his balcony, looking out at the stars. He knew that change didn't come overnight, and that, true, accountability required more than just words. But he also knew that sometimes a single moment could spark a chain reaction, one that forced even the most powerful institutions to rethink their actions. And so, he waited, because he had already made his move. Now it was up to the airline to make theirs. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. The airline, once a towering symbol of global travel and modern efficiency, now stood on the edge of collapse. Its leadership had issued public apologies, retrained security personnel, and launched internal investigations, but none of it seemed to matter. The damage was deeper than policies or press releases could fix. Investors had lost faith, passengers had lost trust, and the world watched closely, waiting to see if the company would rise from the ashes or be swallowed by its own mistakes. Inside the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Meetings stretched late into the night, filled with hushed voices and urgent discussions about how to stabilize what remained. Financial advisors worked tirelessly to find new sources of funding. Legal teams prepared for potential lawsuits, and public relations experts searched desperately for a way to regain control of the narrative. But every attempt to shift the story back in their favor was met with sharp criticism from the public, who saw their efforts as too little, too late. Outside, the situation was no better. Airports across the country reported delays and cancellations due to financial strain. Suppliers demanded immediate payments, fearing the airline wouldn't survive long enough to fulfill contracts. Employees whispered about layoffs, while loyal customers canceled bookings, unsure if the company would even exist in a few months. The once proud brand had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when misused, could crumble faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, the elderly man remained out of sight, continuing his journey without interruption. He had left the coastal town behind and traveled to a quiet countryside estate, where he spent his mornings walking through lush green fields and his evenings reading by the fire. He did not watch the news or check stock reports. He already knew the outcome would unfold as it should. What mattered most was not the fall of a single airline, but the lesson it carried for others who might follow the same path. Back at the airline's offices, the CEO sat alone in his office, staring at a blank screen. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from concerned investors, others from angry employees, many from reporters demanding statements. He had spent years building this company, believing in its mission, shaping its identity. And now, all of it was slipping away because of one decision made in haste. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his senior advisors entered, holding a folder tightly in both hands. "We received a response," the advisor said quietly. The CEO straightened up, his heart pounding. "From him?" The advisor nodded. "Yes." There was a pause before the folder was placed on the desk. Inside were just a few lines written in neat handwriting on crisp white paper. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an acceptance of their request. It was something else entirely, an invitation. "If you are willing to listen, I will speak." No date, no location, no conditions. Just those words, simple and direct. The message was clear. The elderly man was giving them one last chance. The room fell silent as the weight of the moment settled over them. This was it, their final opportunity to make things right. If they failed, there would be no second chances. The CEO took a deep breath and picked up the phone. Within minutes, plans were set in motion. A private jet was arranged, a small team was assembled, and strict instructions were given to keep everything under wraps. They didn't want media attention, they didn't want speculation, they wanted a conversation, nothing more. Days later, the group arrived at a secluded villa nestled in the hills of a quiet European town. The place was modest yet elegant, surrounded by olive trees and overlooking the sea. There were no cameras, no reporters, no distractions, only the sound of the wind and the distant hum of waves against the shore. Inside, the elderly man waited. He was seated at a wooden table, a cup of tea resting beside him. He looked calm, composed as if he had been expecting them all along. No one spoke at first. There was no need. The air between them carried the weight of everything that had happened, the awe, arrogance, the consequences, the lessons learned. Finally, the CEO stepped forward. "Thank you for meeting with us." The elderly man gave a slight nod but said nothing. The CEO continued, choosing his words carefully. "We understand what we did was wrong. We acted without thinking, without respect, and we know that words won't undo the damage. But we're here because we want to learn. We want to change." For a long moment, the elderly man simply studied him. Then finally, he spoke. "Power is not in titles or money. It is in the choices we make. You chose poorly." The CEO lowered his head. "I know." The old man leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me, What have you done differently since then? One of the advisors stepped in, explaining the steps taken: policy changes, leadership restructuring, mandatory training programs for security personnel. Every measure was listed, every reform detailed. The elderly man listened patiently, never interrupting, never showing emotion. When they finished, he took a slow sip of his tea before speaking again. Actions speak louder than promises. Show me what you've done, not what you say you'll do. It was a challenge, and they all understood it. Over the next several hours, the meeting continued. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations. Just honest conversations, difficult questions, and moments of reflection. The elderly man shared stories from his own career, lessons he had learned from watching companies rise and fall. He spoke of integrity, of humility, of the responsibility that came with leadership. By the time the meeting ended, the group left changed, not because they had received forgiveness, but because they had been given perspective. The elderly man had not promised to restore their finances, nor had he guaranteed a return to stability, but he had offered something more valuable: guidance. As the private jet lifted off the ground, the CEO looked out the window, watching the villa disappear. Below, he knew the road ahead would be long, that rebuilding trust would take years. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to hope. And far away, standing on the balcony of his villa, the elderly man watched the sun dip below the horizon. He had done what he came to do. Now it was up to them to decide what kind of company they would become. Because real change didn't come from pressure or fear. It came from understanding, and that above all was the most powerful force of all. The airline's transformation did not happen overnight, but it began with a single step. The meeting with the elderly man had left a deep impression on its leadership. They returned to headquarters changed, not in appearance, but in mindset. For years they had operated under the belief that size and power made them untouchable. Now they understood that true strength came from humility, respect, and accountability. In the weeks that followed, real changes took place. Security policies were revised, ensuring that no passenger would ever again be removed without clear, justifiable cause. Training programs were introduced for staff at every level, focusing not only on protocol but on empathy and understanding. The officer who had ejected the elderly man was reassigned, given new responsibilities that required more patience than authority. He never spoke publicly about the incident, but those close to him said he carried the weight of his mistake with quiet regret. Publicly, the airline launched a campaign centered around transparency and improvement. They admitted their faults openly, sharing internal reports and inviting independent oversight. It was a bold move, one that many doubted would work. But slowly, passengers began to take notice. Some returned out of curiosity, others out of loyalty, and a few simply because they believed in second chances. Behind the scenes, financial recovery was slower but steady. Investors who had once fled now watched carefully, weighing whether the company's changes were genuine or merely performative. A few cautiously returned, testing the waters before committing fully. Partners who had cut ties reopened discussions, intrigued by what they saw unfolding. The airline wasn't back to where it had been before the incident, but it was moving forward. The CEO, once seen as a leader blinded by confidence, became a symbol of change. He gave interviews not to defend past actions, but to explain what had been learned. He spoke about the importance of listening, about how power without responsibility was dangerous. His words weren't always met with applause, but they were heard. And over time, trust began to rebuild. Meanwhile, the elderly man continued his quiet life, far from the spotlight. He never sought recognition for what had happened, nor did he claim victory over the airline's downfall. To him, it had never been about winning or losing. It had been about setting things right. He received occasional messages from former associates, some offering thanks, others asking for advice. He responded when he could, always with brevity and wisdom. His name remained unknown to most of the world, but within certain circles, it carried immense weight. Business leaders spoke of him in hushed tones, using his example as a lesson in leadership and integrity. Young executives studied his career path, trying to understand how someone so unassuming could hold such influence. And though he never wrote a book or gave a speech, his story became legend, a tale of quiet power and the consequences of forgetting who truly holds it. Back at the airport where everything had begun, the atmosphere had shifted. Travelers noticed small but meaningful differences: staff who smiled more, security personnel who approached situations with care rather than force, and a general sense that something had changed. The incident had left scars, but also lessons that wouldn't soon be forgotten. One morning, months after the meeting in the European villa, the CEO stood at the edge of a terminal watching planes take off into the sky. He thought about everything that had happened: the fall, the struggle, the slow climb back. He knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He pulled out his phone and typed a short message. It wasn't an apology, nor a request for favor. It was simply a thank you. He sent it to an old number, unsure if it would even be read. A day later, a reply arrived. Just 2 words: "You're welcome." That was all. No further discussion, no demands, no expectations, just acknowledgement. And in that moment, the CEO understood something important. He hadn't won back favor, but he had earned respect. As he walked away from the window, he passed a young family preparing for a flight. The mother held her child's hand tightly, while the father checked their boarding passes. There was laughter, excitement, nervous energy, all the things that made air travel special. The CEO smiled slightly, realizing that this was what it was all about. Not money, not power, not reputation, but people. And somewhere, far from the noise of airports and headlines, the elderly man sat quietly in his study, reading a book by the fire. He had no need to follow the airline's progress closely. He already knew what mattered most. Change had taken root, and that was enough. Because power, real power, didn't come from wealth or status. It came from knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to let others find their own way forward. And sometimes the greatest strength of all was knowing when to walk away.